The Music Maker Relief Foundation was founded to preserve the musical traditions of the South by directly supporting the musicians who make it, ensuring their voices will not be silenced by poverty and time. Since our founding in 1994, we've assisted and partnered with more than 300 artists, released 150 CDs, and reached over 1 million people with live performances nationwide in the U.S. and in 17 countries around the globe. The musicians we work with are rooted in the Southern musical traditions of blues, gospel, string band, and Native American. We target our programs to serve the most vulnerable musicians, those 55 years and older with incomes under $18,000 a year. The sad reality is that many of these musicians are getting by on annual incomes of less than $10,000. We started by helping a small group of blues musicians living in poverty in Winston-Salem, North Carolina. Guitar Gabriel, Willa Mae Buckner, Preston Folk, Mr. Q, McAvine Hayes, and others. When we asked how we could help, they didn't ask for money. They wanted a gig.
1, 2, 3, 4.
Through our efforts to secure bookings, document them, and build their careers, these artists were soon performing on national stages at Carnegie Hall, the Lincoln Center, and first-rate European festivals. It became apparent to us very quickly that due to age, poverty, and educational constraints, these elderly artists would need a strong support structure to perform their music beyond their home communities. Some generous music lovers offered to help, and Music Maker Relief Foundation began. We believe that when a musician is living under the stress of dire poverty, they cannot possibly concentrate on their music. Our Musician Sustenance Program provides grants to help with monthly bills for medicine, food and housing, or with emergency funding in times of crisis. The Musical Development Program helps artists hone their skills and gets them playing gigs to earn income. Our Cultural Access Program educates and entertains audiences worldwide with roots and blues music while documenting the artists for future generations. Music Maker works to educate the world about American roots and blues music through live performance. In school workshops, our artists represent the cultural history of the American South, keeping it alive. In addition to advocating for traditional music and working with elderly musicians, Music Maker brings roots music forward by working with younger artists playing in traditional styles. Through our Next Generation program, partnerships between new musicians and the veteran traditional musicians of the South foster the continuation of Southern traditional music among younger generations of musicians. The Music Maker Relief Foundation has taken to heart what our founding artist Guitar Gabriel told us early on. The blues is a spirit, and it will never die. Thus we feel our mission to promote and preserve American traditional music has just begun.
Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for joining us. My name is Tess Stogner, and I'm the Communications Coordinator at the Music Maker Foundation. Tonight, I have the privilege to sit down with Denise Duffy, Music Maker's co-founder and managing director. I want to welcome any newcomers and tell you a bit about what we do. Since 1994, Music Maker has worked to meet the day-to-day needs of over 500 artists who create traditional American music, ensure their voices are heard, and give all people access to our nation's hidden musical treasures. We provide artists with grants, book their performances, create books, recordings, and exhibitions to build cultural equity for our partner artists. As Giving Tuesday is upon us, I encourage y'all to check out our website at musicmaker.org to find out what we're about and donate what you can to support the incredible artists we partner with at Music Maker. We'll be checking in on the chat. So if you have any questions for Denise, feel free to send them our way. And I personally am very excited to hear Denise's side of the story of how this community and nonprofit came to be and how it's grown over the past 28 years. So let's dive in. To start us off, Denise, can you tell us about what you were up to when Tim was looking for Guitar Gabriel and what your thoughts on his to find him?
Sure, thanks, Tess. So Tim, we were living in Winston-Salem, and so this was probably in 1990, 1991. Tim was just finishing up his master's degree in folklore. We were living in Winston-Salem, and I was working back then, and my first career was in the apparel industry. I worked in product development, and so I was working every day, making for a company that made women's sportswear. And Tim had, at the end of his work at the University of North Carolina and his master's degree, had been asked to interview guitarist Slim Stevens. I was a blues man from Greensboro who had terminal cancer at the time, and they wanted an oral history. And so the faculty asked him to go because he's really a terrific field worker, and they knew he'd make the most of the opportunity. And Slim, in his dying days, told Tim, "You got to find Guitar Gabriel if you love this music, if you want to know more. He's the best guy out there." And Gabe was living in Winston-Salem, but had given up playing publicly, and really wasn't out on the scene at all. And Tim spent several months, he was, just got out of folklore school, and you can imagine how many folklore jobs there were then. I think there's about as many now. And so he was substitute teaching, and when he would go to the schools in East Winston, he would ask the kids, "Where's Guitar Gabriel?" And people told him, "Oh, he's burned up in a house fire." And then finally one girl said, I know where you can find him, and drew him. He's my neighbor, and drew a map. And so Tim went and found this character, and Gabe immediately sensed, told him, I know where you want to go. Like, I can take you there. You want to find out about this music. And, immediately kind of had this trust with Tim, although he told him they had kind of a simple arrangement that, if Tim ever ripped him off, Gabe would shoot him. And so it was a really, clear partnership. And they just started playing, and Tim, would try and get gigs, and, at all the little clubs around, found a drummer, put together, a little act. And, even sometimes my friend Peggy and I, we'd sing backup for him at the local clubs. And, he tried to find a record deal, and it became clear that the industry just really wasn't going to work for Gabe, or for any, wasn't really working for artists like this. And so, it was, I think at first we didn't know where it was going, but Gabe seemed to believe in Tim, and that mattered. And Tim we had no money. We were so broke. And Tim, really wanted to break the European festival circuit for Gabe, thought he could. And so he got the blues magazines, and he would write postcards to all of the festivals. And eventually, because he couldn't afford phone calls to Europe, and eventually he got gigs. He finally got a gig in Utrecht, Holland. It was a big deal. And then got in touch with Spike Barkin at Lincoln Center, and got Gabe and Willa Mae booked at the Circus Blues show at Carnegie Hall in 1993. So that kind of started us along there. And there was this whole community of artists, and Tim would load everybody up in his van on check day, and then they'd all go stand in the commodity cheese lines. And, he just started kind of living life with these artists. And I think that's how he really, discovered like what they were up against, both in like the music business and as being, elderly people in America without savings.
So at what point did you feel compelled to leave your full-time career in the fashion industry to start at Music Maker?
So that was a few years later. So, I mean, Tim went around gigging with people and started, recording the artists. And, I mean, I thought it was all fascinating, and but I think for me, it took a little while to foment. I mean, there were two things going on. I mean, when the idea for the foundation came around in late 1993, that, having tried to get commercial work for these artists, just realizing that, it was such huge hurdles that, he was not going to be able to create viable kind of middle-class careers for all these artists. And most of whom were in their 60s and 70s in this group at the time. But they had real immediate needs. And a friend suggested, like, well, why, if you had a nonprofit, people could donate and, you could get stuff. And so, for the art, help these artists. And that seemed like a pretty good idea. And then, still try and build their careers and see what could be done. So while, I had trained for this career in the fashion industry, I was always interested in small business. And so when Tim conceived the foundation, I said to him, you've got that, excuse me, that whole 501c3 thing, 1023 form has to be filed and someone would need to kind of run this. And I had an interest in small business. My father was always self-employed, and ran small businesses. And I always thought that was interesting. I always wanted to kind of chart my own destiny. I had this corporate job in fashion and it was, as those jobs go, it wasn't bad. They were, a large corporation and they treated people decently and all, but I always felt, I often saw senior management kind of often making mistakes that we had to live with, working 60 and 80 hours a week a lot of times. And I decided I'd rather work that hard making my own mistakes. And so finally in 94, very soon after we incorporated, I decided to leave my corporate job. Everybody thought I was nuts. Because I had the job with the health insurance and all that stuff. I knew I could still freelance. I had these pattern making skills that I could freelance with. And so when I first quit my job, I continued to do some freelance and work in the industry somewhat. But then I started running the business. And at that time, Music Maker, the foundation was just starting. I mean, we weren't paid or anything. We were just raising some funds to, grant to the artists or use as expenses to go on field trips to meet the artists, things like that. And Tim was working as a contract producer, starting to produce records, using, getting his recordings placed, being a contract with some labels. And we kind of continued to make our living until a little close to 2000, really doing that production work. My freelancing I just did for a couple years, but then, the work seemed to grow and Music Maker started growing and we were busy. And then also a couple years after I left my job, we had our first child. So we became very busy. And I just kind of, and I still love to make things. I still love to draft patterns. I still sew and stuff, but I just found the work really compelling. Yes, this is a shot of us at those early days. This is probably I'm thinking this is Labor Day, 1995. And there's Guitar Gabriel. At this point, he was not well, no longer really able to perform. Right there in front row, and next to him, Willa Mae Buckner. And on the other side of him, Nora Milner, and in the back row, McAvine Hayes and Captain Luke and Mr. Q and some friends. Yeah, and it was that kind of family feeling right from the start. It seemed, we were kind of young and naive, but the artists, Gabe and Willa, like they really directed us and kind of, they saw the vision, I think, for Music Maker and what it could do before we did, and really understood the value of a community that we could do things together that none of us could do alone. And they really instilled that in us.
That's beautiful. So we've got a question in the chat that I think I'll be interested to hear your answer with your expertise. But in your opinion, who are the most fashionable music maker artists?
Well, these are folks that really have, a very finely honed sense of sartorial expression. So, if I go back, there's the living artists among us now, and then there's the many artists who we've served over time. Little Freddie King he's just amazing. He just lights up every room he comes into and just has a way of putting things together. I don't think you'll meet a more dapper individual ever, and more exuberant stylist. Pat Mother Blues also really does a great job, a great sense of fun and flair. And so Aretta Woodruff, that we just went to Telluride with, she's incredibly stylish, beautiful woman who just really knows how to use her expression. And Ironing Board Sam too, just really exuberant, expressive. And I think, they're really very liberated in how they see their expression. And I am always impressed especially when Tim asks artists to come do photo shoots. They really put a lot of thought and care into everything they're and really understand what they're presenting. There's nothing haphazard about how most of these artists present themselves. They're highly curated. Captain Luke was amazing. The stuff on his hat, but everything had significance. And yet that, nobody was looking at a magazine for inspiration. It was just really their genuine artistic expression.
Yeah, and it was all intentional.
Absolutely.
And playful too.
Yeah.
So
I gotta give Martha Spencer a shout out for a younger artist. Martha really, really enjoys it all.
Yeah, this is a great shot too.
Yeah, those New Orleans guys. That's Freddie and Alabama Slim and Guitar Lightning Lee.
So was there one specific moment for you that you can remember when you realized what Music Maker could become, or do you feel like it was more of a process?
I think it was gradual, because I think as we started, the first kinds of purchases we made were, it seemed all very literal. We started, Guitar Gabriel needed to ensure because he had a stricture in his throat, he couldn't eat solid food, and someone donated a pallet of Ensure to the foundation, and so there it was. And sometimes there were questionable purchases. I remember finding myself at the pet store buying frozen rats to feed Willa Mae's snakes, and I'm just like, is this how I should be using charitable funds. But her snakes were acting. She needed to keep them fed, and it meant the world to her. So I'm like, yeah, we need to do this. But I think the impact, so there are these very direct, you buying heating oil for someone, right? Everybody understands those impacts. I think over time, what became clearer to me was really, and it took time to see transformations in artists. Like I think of Cootie Stark, who, we met Cootie. He was a blind man living alone, Greenville, South Carolina, playing pizza joints for $50. Often playing like Fats Domino tunes, Blueberry Hill, whatever he thought people wanted to hear. And Tim sought him out and started talking to him about, and Tim, Cootie was a wonderful artist, but he knew, like, I can't get Cootie a gig playing Blueberry Hill for people. And also because he'd have to look at what was also marketable, because Cootie wanted more. He wanted new audiences, broader audiences. And so, Tim started talking to him. Well, who you learn from Baby Tate and your Uncle Chump, and what is the material you learned with them? And then Cootie would start sharing songs that he had written himself. He's like, I didn't think anybody wanted to hear this, but Tim's like, yeah, that's what they really want to hear. Like, let's leave Fats Domino to Fats. And so I saw Tim work with Cootie, bringing other musicians in and broaden that repertoire. And you get Cootie out to audiences, and Cootie was just so ready to go, so they traveled all over Europe, all over the States. And then I just saw this transformation in Cootie's life, right? Suddenly, he's getting, and he's getting written up in the newspaper because he went to Paris. So all of a sudden, the people in his hometown, at the local diner where he goes to have coffee, those ladies see the newspaper articles and they start treating him up a little more nicely and with a bit more RESPCT. And Cootie now, sees himself as an artist, and not just, playing somebody's cover songs, really, and starts pushing himself harder. And the music itself is elevated. And then Cootie met so many new people, and Cootie created all of these relationships with people. And now, like, his whole life was really transformed. And I think when I saw those transformations, and it took some years, I realized that the impact could be broader, both on Cootie, on the community, and on the art form itself, that by supporting these artists, you could have a very broad impact on the culture, on individual people's lives, and on the broader culture. And not to mention, preserving it all for future generations, because we don't know, right? So many artists are not appreciated in their own lifetime, right? Nobody was really supporting Van Gogh much in his lifetime, and now he's everything. So we don't know which one of these artists could inspire a whole nother generation. We won't know that yet. And so their work is vitally important. And I think it took some years for me to see that all happen. I think the Blues Revival tour we did with Taj Mahal in 98 and 99, we did 42 cities with with Cootie Stark and Neil Patman and Beverly Guitar Watkins on tour with Taj. And then, seeing, like, taking that show to these great venues all over the country, and seeing like, 23-year-old kids pull their hair out watching, Beverly Watkins blow their mind on her knees, and like, oh, it's not just us, like, other people think these guys are amazing too. Because everybody would come in, looking, I want to buy a ticket to see Taj Mahal, and they'd go out talking about Neil or Cootie. And yes, of course, they love Taj too, but it just kind of turning people on and seeing that impact. So it took really for me until the mid late 90s to see that we really were on to something, and something very different. And I think, we had a decision to make in the late 90s, all of Tim's in 12/31/99, all of our big record contracts were up, as well as this tour concluded that we were doing. And as of the dawning of the millennium, there was going to be no money coming in the door. There was neither for the nonprofit, because the nonprofit, all of its revenue was dependent upon the commercial contracts we have, because we always made sure that any commercial contract we had would kick something back to the foundation, keep the foundation going. Like, Tim, a percentage of sales or whatever would always benefit Music Maker. So we were like, what are we going to do? We're sitting here. Yeah, of course, I was like 8 months pregnant, and we already got a kid, and there's no more money coming from any place. And it was like, well, what are we going to do? Are we going to try and be an indie label and save, and try and run that business and be like another record label? Because all our other relationships, the previous relationships with record labels, they were okay, but they were so slow. They didn't get the records out fast enough, and our artists were literally dying in front of us, and they needed these records out. So are we going to be a record label, or are we going to try and save this nonprofit? And we just decided that, because I knew I couldn't do both, especially as pregnant as I was. And we decided that the nonprofit was just the more compelling idea. And we turned to a couple stalwart supporters, people who had been donating, who knew a lot more than we did about nonprofit. And we were like, what do we do? And they're like, well, have you ever, sent anybody a letter in an envelope and suggested they, stick a check in the envelope and send it back to you? We were like, oh, no, we've not done that. That sounds like a good idea. And so, we started fundraising and just really focusing all our energy on the nonprofit instead of chasing record labels. And I think it was a wise choice. It was just a much more interesting idea.
And you mentioned this earlier with Guitar Gabriel and Willamay. But yeah, who were some of the artists that mentored you and Tim as you were starting out, and what sort of advice did they have for y'all?
So, they advised us on many things over time, I think. But I think it was their living examples that mattered most. They would just, they had really hard lives. They'd come up poor as dirt in the Jim Crow South. Did not have the benefit of education. But they had, been subject to a lot of poor treatment, and yet they still believed that good things could happen, and still believed in trying and performing and trying to reach people and kind of believing in people in spite of it all. And I think that example, we couldn't quit if they were going to quit, right? Like, and I also, think it was our supporters until this day that keep us going, when we started, it was just this idea, but we kept meeting people who were willing to support the organization, thought it was a good idea, thought this music mattered, thought these artists mattered. They were unfamous people. Nobody knew their names, but they knew that, but these other, Americans thought their cultural heritage mattered. I think, all of those people over the years have mattered. And many of those supporters have been on our board. People have come through our board. There's just been so many people to learn from the whole time. And that artist knowledge base is something, we relied on the beginning, and we continue to rely on it to this day. We're always, when we started this, we were young and we had this artist cutoff that, we helped artists that were 55 and older. Well, we picked that number because we thought 55 was really old. And of course, now I'm on the north side of that, looking at that in the rear view mirror going, but like, we still are learning from the artists all the time, I mean, Freeman Vines has been an incredible inspiration to us, and has taught us so much, about art, about race, and there's just like the music itself is also an education, right? So this American roots music that we have was built as an oral tradition that is a repository of knowledge, and it is how people passed on what they had learned to the next generation, right? And so, there's just so much wisdom in the music itself.
Yeah. Great question here in the chat. So Travis Hinneveld asks, looking forward as a nonprofit organization, what are some key areas to develop and grow?
So, I mean, as a nonprofit, so you always, I mean, right now we're looking right now for an advancement director. I mean, development, I think, is always, I don't know of a nonprofit that isn't heavily focused on development unless they are incredibly well endowed, and we are not. So as any nonprofit without a giant endowment, you always have to keep your eye on fundraising and development. It's literally what sustains us and what makes our programs possible. And I also think, you always have to be developing talent, looking for, so we develop talent here, both internally in terms of our staff, training, the next generation of folk life field workers and nonprofit fundraisers. So we're always developing that, and we're always looking for new musicians and new talent, because that is the hard part about this job, because we work with senior artists, is that we say bye a lot. And, we hope we do our job. We know we do our job if we made the last few years of an artist's life maybe a little sweeter, got them documented, help them meet some people, and people meet them, then we did our job. But we're always looking for new musicians to bring into the organization. So those are things we focus on heavily. Oh, and technology. Whether you like it or not, the technology is always changing. And because we are dealing with this intangible culture, there's the intangible culture and the tangible culture, right? So we have all of these recordings and oral histories. We have fine art items. Sometimes, some photographs. Anyway, we have a tremendous amount of artworks that need to be preserved, and the technology is constantly changing. And so making sure that we keep that archive safe is a continual challenge, and it's a moving bar. Every few years, just when we think we have the next best technology, it's like, nope, we got to go again. And so that's something we're always modernizing and keeping ahead on.
Yeah. And I just want to mention for everyone watching again, as Giving Tuesday approaches tomorrow, we are having a 2-for-1 matching campaign right now. So if you any donation will be matched. up to $100,000 this
Right.
for this month. So if you're able, please donate what you can. And my next question for you is, what is one of the most unexpected places Music Maker has taken you?
Music Maker has taken me so many places. It's taken me some pretty exotic places. I mean, there's kind of exotic by anyone's standards. For years we did a fishing tournament with Taj Mahal down in Costa Rica. And so we would take a group of musicians and, 15 fishermen and go down to a little spit of sand at the southernmost tip of Costa Rica to play the blues and fish for a week. And, the last night, the whole jungle, all the locals would come out from the jungle and we'd have a big party for everybody. It'd be like 500 people. It was kind of crazy. So I've been some exotic places on tour like that. Not as many as Tim, because I was mostly here I was often raising children when the exotic tours were going on. But then I think to me, what's been more meaningful is seeing my own country in a very different way. So traveling, deep into Alabama, even in Eastern North Carolina, just going to rural places and seeing parts of America that were just so very different from where I was raised. Really seeing, frankly, often, seeing very rural farm conditions, people living in extremely humble homes, difficult circumstances often. And that just gave me a lot of perspective on my own culture and gave me a much deeper understanding of what we call deep America. I've grown, I've been living in the South for 37, 38 years. And it just is really, I just love it more all the time. And the South has a complicated history, but our whole country has a complicated history. But I just have great affection for rural America. And then also in our cities too, you gotta love, got to spend a lot of time in New Orleans and just all different cities in Birmingham, got different pockets of America. I love that. I just still love to go visit.
That's so cool. You mentioned raising your children. So what was it like to have your children growing up around these artists?
Well, I'm sure they would have their own, take on it. From when my kids were born, so here you see they were a little older here, but it's really like an extended family, so it was always holidays and birthdays and whatnot. The artists were always around, and and their own grandparents lived many hundreds of miles away, and so it was often the artists that were going to be around on birthdays and holidays, and so they really grew up in this family setting. I think there was very little, so from when the time Lucas was born in 96 up until 10 years ago, really. So almost the whole growing up, our home and the office and often a residential spot for artists were all right together. So there was not a lot of separation between family and Music Maker, which, for the kids, they'll tell me, like, they got sick. There was a lot of shop talk at the dinner table. still is. But I also think, like, sometimes it meant you came home from that, they'd come home from school and there were, a dozen, Tuscarora and Lumbee Indians, chanting and dancing on their patio. And the next week, an Australian folk rock band would be recording with John D. Holman in the next room and all having dinner. And, New Orleans singer-songwriters living with them for months after Katrina. And so I think it was a rich growing up. I mean, they're certainly well-versed in American roots music, whether they, and I do think they valued, the exposure to the artists. I mean, and for me, it meant that I could work and raise a family. Having that all together made it feasible for me. I know when I was, before I had my kids and I was working in corporate America, I saw these moms that, dropped their kids off at 6:30 in the morning and picked them up at 6:30 at night. And were even told at that they weren't really dedicated to work. And I was like, if I have to have my kids that way, I don't want to have kids. And so I think, so whether my kids got a little more exposure to my work than they wanted, it just meant that, I could be with them and I could be close to work and, have that all be part. And they, my kids sure knew what their parents did. Okay, now this was a New Year's party here at the office, and I promise you that child only slept there for an hour or two. The party was going late, and poor baby, they just needed to take a break. But that child did go back to their bed. Yeah.
An iconic photo. So we've got a question from Jordan in San Francisco, who asks, can you discuss how you all came to your geographical span for music maker artists?
Okay. Well, this is interesting. I think we were in North Carolina. So, and Tim's history, he started working with these group of blues artists. And before that, he had met all these Appalachian musicians when he was doing his folklore degree. He worked with Appalachian string band musicians in Western North Carolina. And then generally we kind of meet musicians through musicians. And so it was often kind of like these concentric circles. But it was so we started, the blues artists would introduce us to other blues artists, and then you might find someone who, plays blues and gospel, and they'd introduce you to their gospel friends. And so we followed, and also I think Tim, sometimes he followed the trails of some folklorists that had been around in the 70s, guys like George Mitchell. We went around to see, is Precious Bryant still in this town in Georgia, and is John Lee Ziegler still in Kathleen, Georgia? And of course, you go to these tiny towns and ask at the Minnie Martin, sure, that guy's been living there for 40 years. Of course, he's still down there. So we would do that. We just feel like the American South is, and particularly, I'll say this for the Carolinas, in Virginia, because we could have moved. I mean, there were times we could have moved the foundation. We could have moved to New Orleans or Atlanta, or, we were going to be in the South, because we feel the South is where, is kind of the place that defines American music, because it is the place where you have these, native peoples with their harmony and rhythmic traditions. And then you bring over the European stringed instruments and ballad singing traditions as Europeans come. And then there are enslaved Africans brought here, and they bring, they bring the banjo and their rhythmic traditions and singing traditions. You put all these people together on the same farm in the South, and you end up with blues and gospel, and the string band music, that then, turns into country and bluegrass and rock and roll and everything else. So it is this melting pot in the South, that creates that. And so, that has been our focus. And we think the Carolinas and Virginia in particular, as this is where the enslaved folks were brought, and this was like the first place in the country where all of those peoples come together. 100 years later, they get sold down the river and they go to Mississippi, and Louisiana. Thanks to Eli Whitney, they're sold down there, and then those traditions, musically do wonderful things. I mean, as much as people, of course, the suffering is unfathomable, but musically they do great things from there. But we also have stayed largely focused on Carolinas, and these days Alabama, doing a lot of work there, because we feel these places have largely been ignored, right? I do think Mississippi and Louisiana do a good job of touting their musical legacy, and I herald them for doing it, but I don't think we do such a good job here in North Carolina. And so we focus a lot of energy on Carolina artists, on Georgia artists, and in Alabama, because we think they just don't get as much attention and as much documentation. And so that's where we focused a lot of our work.
Yeah. Okay, I've got a story here from John Hatton. I remember when Gabe came out to the Country Blues Festival at Centrum in Port Townsend. It was the final concert and Gabe left the stage. Pinetop Perkins, Paul Rochelle, and Annie Raines were on the stage playing an encore, Sweet Home Chicago. Gabe was relegated to a chair on the side of the stage. At the time, he was having trouble walking. He looked at me and called me over and said, "Put me up there." Bob was nearby and I cued the sound man. As we raised Gabe back up to the stage, the crowd went nuts. The sound crew brought out an extra mic for Gabe, and he finished the encore with Pinetop, Paul, and Annie. Standing ovation and no end to the audience appreciation. A fine, touching moment for Gabe, and Gabe's fur hat was never happier. It's a great story.
Yeah, it's a great story. And Gabe had that kind of presence. Gabe, he just had this thing. One of Gabe's favorite thing to do was just like he walking up the street, if they had a quiet afternoon, they go into it like one of those multiplex movie theaters. And Gabe would just walk in. No one ever asked Gabe for a ticket anywhere. He could just walk in the door like he belonged. He didn't need a ticket. No one was going to ask him. And they would just go from theater to theater. They'd watch like 5 minutes of every movie, but yeah, no one ever asked to see his ticket. He was good to ride. But he knew who he was,
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I just want to shout out again that we've got a matching campaign going on right now. So any donation made will be matched up to $100,000 for the rest of November, which is not very long. So if you're able, please make a donation. Also, just want to say hi to Shelton Poe, and thanks for tuning in and watching and sharing. Shelton's one of our partner artists and recently came out with a self-titled album, which is wonderful, and you all should give it a listen if you haven't already. My next question for you, Denise, is what is one way that Music Maker has changed its approach since 1994?
So I think over time, one of the big shifts was when we started, we used to refer to our artists as recipient artists because they were the recipients of grants from the organization. But we realized over time that was a real misnomer, and it was misleading. because it sounded as if the artists were passive. And what we realized to accomplish the goals Music Maker had set out, the cultural goals, to reach people, to record, to get out and perform, and to bring this music to so many more people, that what was required of the artists was really a lot, and that they were partners, and that we really needed artists who were willing to give it their all. And over time, there have been so many artists that really got it. And right, I'm looking at you, Tess. Behind you is a picture of Adolphus Bell, and yeah, and he was one of those guys who just like got it. Like, he met us, he was living in his van, and like he just wanted to work, and so we went out and got him gigs, and within a matter of months, he was all set up in an apartment. He was saving money, putting it in the bank for a rainy day. He sold, he was in the breakfast room. He was, selling CDs in the hotel lobby, like everywhere. Like, he got it, and he was gonna work it, and he worked so hard. And had tremendous success. I mean, he was so well loved. He traveled all over Europe. He went to Russia. He went to some really exotic places, and just really lived it up. Really enjoyed it.
Yeah. And in the past 28 years, how has this work shaped and changed you, who you are?
It's been, such a learning and growing experience. I think, I'm always just bowled over with gratitude. Just, for the artists who are so willing to be vulnerable and go out there and give their all to people, and for our supporters who are so generous, and are so willing to, take this leap of faith with us, and believe in those artists. So, it just never ceases to knock me out. And that's, always keeps me going. I think, the older I get, the more willing, I am to accept how little I know and how much I can learn, from everybody. And I'm much more comfortable with the not knowing. When people ask me, like, what are we going to do now? And I'm like, I don't know. But we figure it out together, we just will keep going. So so I think I'm kind of in some ways more jaded, but in some ways a lot less jaded, and willing to take those risks with people. And I think one of the most exciting things, and I'm really, now that I'm on the other side of that whole 55 thing, I really get to see, what Music Maker, when I started this, and we were in our early 30s, at just 30, when we started this, like, to me, like, how we thought the 55, was old. Like, well, that by then, you're kind of, washed up and things are going good now. But what I see these artists is, I've seen people start whole new careers at 71, 72 years of age, never been on a plane before in their life, and get on their first flight to Australia. Like, they're just intrepid. And you can have these adventures like that, that third act in life. It doesn't have to be, washed up sitting home alone. Like, you can go out and adventure and see the world and still have a lot to offer and a lot to learn in your 70s, in your 80s. I've seen it happen again and again. So, I mean, I'm just kind of excited that there's still a lot to look forward to. And the story, it ain't over till it's over.
That was a beautiful answer. Thank you. So in your day-to-day, what are you seeing as one of the most challenging challenging issues that artists are facing right now?
Well, I mean, everybody is really just coming out of the COVID experience, which, of course was like was devastating to performance, right? For 2 years, everything was shut down, and it really hurt some of the performance kind of infrastructure, right? There's some festivals that aren't coming back, some venues that aren't coming back. A lot of the weekly jams and things people were doing, like all of that has to be restructured, and some of it's coming back. I mean, and for some of our artists, that's problematic because 2 years has aged them, and they may not have the health they had a couple years ago, and so it's challenging. So that's always a challenge for them. Health is always a challenge for our artists by virtue of their age. And then, currently, I think, the cost of living has really skyrocketed. And for folks on a fixed income, like it's just that much harder. They were having a hard time keeping the fridge full till the end of the month before the pandemic, and that has not gotten easier. And I don't think anybody who's been to the grocery store the past year would argue with you. So I think that those challenges, and I mean, in some ways I hate to say, like, they're not different challenges than the challenges the artists were facing, when we first met Gabe and Willa, right? It's still trying to get through the month and keep food in the fridge for so many of these artists. And, while the work we do can alleviate some of that stress, we're never going to be able to raise enough money to make everybody middle class. Like, that's just not a realistic goal. But we can make things a little better. But right now, I think the inflation is tough, and I think it's tough for folks. Home repairs are always a big issue. I mean, a surprising a fair amount, at least half of our artists own their homes. But again, they're living on such tight money, they can't afford the repairs when they put in a new roof, put in a new furnace, like those sorts of large expenses when you're living on $1,200 a month are just really tough. I mean, so we do try and make some larger grants to be able to cover those things, because that can make a huge difference for those artists, a lot less stress, and actually get those repairs done. Because sometimes we find folks are living without heat. They want it, and you have to tell them. I mean, most of them aren't going to call you and tell you that. But we find out, we do our annual survey, which is being conducted right now. Brittany will interview artists, and they're incredibly generous with the information they share with us. It's pretty intimate information about their financial lives, their health and well-being. But we often find out about needs that were unseen, because proud folks, hardworking folks, have been working their whole lives, and often because they don't make money, they're used to living without. And so we often, like I said, it's not always that forthcoming, but then when we find out about those needs, we can really step up and make a difference. And that's because of the donor support. So we're really thankful to have that, to help to try and meet some of these needs for folks and make them comfortable.
Yeah, and I just want to shout out Brittany Anderson, our artist services coordinator, who is the social worker who makes all of this happen. And can you tell us a little bit more about what Brittany does?
So Brittany has really broad skills, and will work, really kind of sees, we always like try to approach this model as seeing a whole person. So, Tim and the programs people are taking care of the musical and professional side of the person, but it takes more than that to be able to show up for all that work. In order to show up for that work, you need your health and in your home to be stable. And so Brittany is there, and she does everything for folks. I mean, she can really do a full intake and evaluation and see where the holes are. So whether that is helping you find some medical care, it could be a dentist, it could be an eye doctor, whatever your needs are. Or a lot of people don't have primary care physicians. So connecting people with resources, helping people fill out an application for subsidized housing or food stamps. I don't know if you ever have seen some of these forms are quite complex and intimidating. And so artists sometimes really need help kind of, just negotiating those systems, and so she can really help them negotiate those bureaucracies. She's helped people, if they've needed people who've been in, kind of traumatic situations, find a therapist to work with. Really, whatever those human needs are, help you call after your house has been messed up, helping deal with the insurance company to get reimbursed if your house has been damaged in a hurricane or whatever. Brittany is just willing to do meet people where they are and help them, with whatever resources they need.
Yeah. As we approach the hour, I want to start wrapping the conversation up, but Brittany is incredible. And yeah, is there anything else that you want to share about what Music Maker is currently up to, or things that have come to mind during the conversation?
We keep incredibly busy. My husband Tim has more ideas in an hour than we could execute in a year. So there's no end to it, which has always been surprising to me. Early on, it's like, things will quiet down, or we want to have new artists, but no, there's always more. And so I think that keeps our work exciting. We are looking forward in the next year or so. We purchased a new building. We're going to be outfitting a new studio where we really are going to, in Eastern North Carolina. We'll be working with a lot of gospel musicians there. We're excited about that space. We're going to keep recording more blues, especially in Birmingham, Alabama. There's just an incredible vibrant community down there. We're pretty excited about being part of. We're expanding our Freight Train Blues series to 8 weeks this coming spring. So everybody, come to Carborough and hang out with us in the spring, these beautiful spring evenings. And just always wanting to thank our supporters who make this work possible, and the artists. It's just such a privilege to do this work, and a lot of joy. And we just really love being part of it.
Yeah. And for an upcoming event in the very immediate future for our North Carolina viewers, Sacred Soul, documentary on gospel musicians that Music Maker has worked with, that we partnered with Bible and Tire to produce, is airing on PBS NC at 8 p.m. right after this. So starting now.
Also in February, come see us. We're doing a mini festival at the National Gallery on February 26th. So we look forward to seeing you there.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much, Denise, for your time. And thank you to everyone who joined us tonight. I know I really enjoyed this conversation. And again, if you're able, please consider making a donation so that we can continue to support these artists and make sure that their voices are heard. So thank you all.
Thanks, everybody. Good night.
I'm little Freddie Kane, the old blues player. So I'm asking all your donators to please donate to Music Makers Foundation, please, to help all the old artists, please. And thank you all so much for being done such a wonderful job.
Hello, everybody. This is Leonard Lowdown Brown, and I want to talk to you about the Music Maker Foundation. And please go to the Music Maker Foundation website and check it out. This is an organization that helps musicians that would never be seen or heard of So thank you very much, and please give.
Asking of the dedicated men of Zion, I'm asking you if you would please consider donating to the Music Makers Foundation this November. And remember, he laid his hands on me.
Hey, I'm Martha Spencer.
I'm Archer. Please donate to Music Maker this holiday season.
Hi, this is Key Amber from Faith and Harmony, asking you to please consider donating to the Music Maker Foundation this November.
En 2022, Music Maker me proveyó un bajo, una sierra cinta, una guitarra acústica y auspició producciones audiovisuales para el relanzamiento de mi carrera acá en los Estados Unidos. Quiero agradecerle a toda la gente de Music Maker. Por favor, a todas las personas que puedan donar, háganlo, pues con sus donaciones podrán apoyar a músicos como yo.
Please donate to Music Maker and your gift will be matched. I made my own self a Music Maker family member. That's the truth. Y'all need to join too and get up with old Tim here and have some fun.